All right, so I'm going to give you just kind of a little mini summary of what was going on with the whole war between Pompey and Caesar, because we haven't even gotten to the main part of this video, and I feel like we've already had a ton of buildup. So I got this little whiteboard for you, and I got my grandpa's family heirloom to help us dissect this war. Just a little bit, just a little quick summary. Caesar did a bunch of conquering in this area. Cisalpine Gaul. May have spelled Cisalpine wrong. My apologies if so. The Senate. These guys down here in this little Senate building. I don't know if you can see that, but basically the Senate gave Caesar an ultimatum. The Senate tells Caesar, if you cross the Rubicon, which is basically just a river that divides Rome and Cisalpine Gaul, if you cross the Rubicon, you'll be considered an enemy of your own country. Which is fucking crazy. So Caesar did take the night to consider this, which is kind of also wild. He took a night to consider this, knowing that if he went down there, he'd most likely be tried in court without impunity because his governorship would be removed, which means they could try him to the full extent of the law, which means probably execution, exile at the very least, from a place he's gained so much power from. And with Pompey acting as sole consul down here in Rome, it kind of became a slight confrontation. But really, this is what happened. Caesar took the night to consider these things, and realizing that his death was most likely waiting on the other side of a door where he was to relinquish all of his powers and not pass the Rubicon, he decided to cross. With Caesar having crossed the Rubicon towards the capital of Rome, towards the Senate, Pompey is forced to flee. Now this seems, okay, on whiteboard, on paper, this seems like what people of our age might call pussy move. That's not what that was. Most of Pompey's armies, allies, they were outside of Rome at this time because in order to be sole consul, you can't basically be in charge of armies or you can't have a governorship. It's kind of complicated. But suffice it to say, no armies were here in Rome, so he took a lot of time to consider whether to abandon Rome and let Caesar just take it, and at the end of all that consideration, he did end up leaving. So we have the beginning of the Roman Civil War here. Many of those, but I think this is the second one. Not that important which one it is. We have another Roman Civil War going on between Pompey the Great, a very decorated general, very popular, charismatic, has a way with, I would describe his battle tactics as practical. Very practical general, knows how to use his advantages to their maximum value. Caesar, on the other hand, is a very adaptable general, and he has a focus on creating advantages instead of seeking them out to use them. So, very interesting lineup. Very, very interesting lineup. Barring all that, their first meetup would be at the Battle of Dyrrhachium. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. I am a normal person. So they meet each other at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, where in many ways, Pompey the Great outwits his younger ex-triumvir, Julius Caesar. God, Pompey was pissing Caesar off, just pissing in his cereal, right? He was cutting off Caesar's supply lines. Caesar was stuck in a place without any allies to create those supply lines, and many times his ships were being completely barred by blockades. Everything looked to be going in Pompey's way, but one single issue, obviously barring the person that he was competing against, Caesar, Pompey's advisors were constantly telling him to press the advantage, whereas Pompey was saying, we need to wait. Our position only strengthens the more we wait for Caesar to be starved out. Caesar's supply lines had been cut off. Pompey knew this, and Pompey was smart enough to take practical advantage of what is basically a God-given victory if they just hold out for months. But Pompey's advisors wouldn't leave it alone. But spoiler, this isn't called Pompey's Civil War, it's called Caesar's. See, Pompey's quick reactions to Caesar's engineering tactics created a tough enemy to meet. Not even considering the fact that Pompey continued to cut off Caesar's supply lines, practically starving his army into mutiny, this would not do. So Caesar would make a decisive blow at one particular battle, the Battle of Pharsalus. See, the annoying thing is that Pompey was in such a fantastic position on a hill which would be considered off screen of the whiteboard up here. Pompey had a superior force, superior cavalry to Caesar up on a hill, an encampment. Caesar was camped down below him in a disadvantageous position. But Pompey's advisors pressed Pompey to attack Caesar because Caesar broke camp to feint them into attacking. But Pompey couldn't argue with his advisors and so gave chase. Setting his right flank against the riverside was a great idea. Caesar can't flank him from this side if there's a river in the way. And so thinking his cavalry was superior, which it was, he made a judgment call and pressed his cavalry towards Caesar's inferior force. It's debated whether Caesar moved his cavalry line into Pompey or if Pompey moved his cavalry line into Caesar's inferior, but I like to lean towards the idea that Caesar indeed did put his lighter cavalry force towards Pompey to bait him into this next, sadly decisive blow for what was a great general of Rome, Pompey. On paper, Pompey's idea here made perfect sense. To meet this somewhat rash attack by Caesar with overwhelming force, and Pompey had good reason to believe that Caesar has been pressed into a corner with such a superior force, caught in an open field, with Pompey still having allies and a supply line nearby, and with a weakened army, starving and close to mutiny. It really made sense for Pompey to press an advantage here, and he did. Now, why did Caesar win? Well, this was a part of Caesar's strategy here. Pompey's cavalry moved in. Cavalry on Caesar's side retreated back, and it looked like Pompey's cavalry was destroying them, but really they were retreating into Caesar's secret line of infantry back here that he had hidden behind the rest of his army. And not only that, something else to add is that Pompey was under the assumption that Caesar was using normal infantry force, which he was. They were using swords and javelins, but he didn't have spearmen to deal with the cavalry. So Pompey thought he was really in no massive danger. But Caesar, in a smart play, admittedly smart play, changed his infantry hiding in this back line to use their javelins, a secondary throwing spear-like weapon. So when Pompey's cavalry moved in, this infantry routed them, and they were forced back into their own line, and eventually they would be crushed. One of Pompey's biggest strategic key points is dead. Caesar obviously takes advantage of this, moving his lines up to Pompey. And with the support cavalry now freed up, and bolstered Caesar's infantry lines in the back here, helping their allies, we have on our hands a upheaval, a disaster for Pompey, really. So Caesar starts to destroy this flank, Pompey's left flank, crushing inwards until basically the infantry and cavalry begin to descend and disintegrate the front line. And they just move in and through till Pompey is forced to flee. Now, this is what Caesar had to say about it. So take it with an atom of salt. When our men were now circulating within the rampart, Pompeius, procuring a horse and tearing off his insignia as imperator, flung himself out of the camp by the Decuman gate, and putting spurs to his horse, hurried straight off to Larissa. Nor did he halt there, but, coming across a few of his men in flight with undiminished speed, not stopping his course at night, arrives at the sea with a retinue of 30 horsemen, and embarks on board a corn ship, often complaining, as it was said, that his expectations had been so utterly falsified that it had almost seemed as if he had been betrayed, the flight having originated with that particular part of his force from which he had hoped for the victory. Again, keep in mind, written from the victor, so yeah. Pompey would then flee to the sea and, charting a boat down to Egypt, would attempt to convince Egyptian allies to side with him in the Roman Civil War, which really made sense. Egypt was a close ally of Rome. It was said by many people within the Senate that Pompey did not have an eye for politics, that he was a general and a general was all he was. I think this is a false interpretation of Pompey, but I do think he was easily convinced of ideas and concept by his peers when they really weren't the best options or choices at the time. But Pompey getting aboard this boat would seal his life.